All right, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Economic Town Hall presented to you by Ignite Fredericton. My name is Adam Peabody. I'm the director of Planet Hatch, and I'll be the MC and host for today's session. We're very excited to be able to move into this discussion, and we have a number of esteemed guests and distinguished speakers who are going to be sharing their thoughts. The focus of this session is to be able to have a discussion on our local economy in Fredericton and across New Brunswick during the present COVID-19 crisis and beyond. Some of the questions that we're going to be attempting to answer throughout today's session is what should businesses be doing right now to survive during the present crisis? What opportunities should entrepreneurs look to take advantage of as we move forward? And what will the new normal look like as we move beyond the crisis into a new state of normal? Just going through the agenda quickly, if we could share the screen. We will be starting with some remarks from His Worship Mayor Mike O'Brien, and then we'll be able to have presentations from two esteemed economists in the province, David Campbell and Dr. Emery. Finally, moving into a panel discussion. I want to invite all of those who are joining us to please share your thoughts and ask questions using the chat box at the bottom of your screen. We will be taking those questions and fielding them. If you ask a question and we aren't able to get to it because of time, I want to let everyone know that we will be following up with those individually after this session to ensure that your questions are answered. And finally, as most of you are, we are still in the process of making sure that we can move to a virtual format, and very pleased to see it seems to be working so far, technology-wise. Knock on wood, that will continue. But if we do run into any technical difficulties, I just ask you to bear with us. A reminder that this session is being recorded, so if anyone would not like to have their face on that recording, you can stop sharing your video with the button on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. With that being said, I will turn it over and invite His Worship Mayor Mike O'Brien to share a few words with us. So Mayor O'Brien, if you want to unmute and begin to share.
I lost my unmute button. I'm gone. Okay, welcome everybody and good morning. Ramadan or happy Ramadan to all people of the Muslim faith. Today is the beginning of Ramadan. And I'm going to try something that I haven't done before on a Zoom meeting, and out of respect and to honor all the victims of that terrible tragedy in Nova Scotia, I'm going to ask that we just collectively take a 15-second moment of silence, please, and thank you. Thank you. As many people have said, in days like this, we're all Nova Scotians and one big Canadian family. The city of Fredericton, just briefly, we've been impacted like a lot of people. We're not a business, we're a service provider, but we've had to think quickly on our feet and how we can still deliver these essential services that citizens pay for and expect. And during this time, we've had about 120 of our employees working full-time at home, and the rest of our employees have been working, but sometimes on shifts or in split shifts and in different ways. But to throw 120 employees to work at home and still be productive has really, we're quite advanced digitally here in the city. We're kind of known across Canada for it. But even that was really pushing the envelope for our IT folks and everybody else to come on board. And we've been able to do it, a few hiccups along the way, but it really makes you think, what is the next step? We've evolved and adapted. We want to get back to normal, whatever the new normal is, but what's it going to look like? We're going to have different kind of workplaces. We got to have social distancing. We're going to have new sanitation procedures like everybody else is going to do. But it really opens up your eyes. What is possible for a municipal government or any level of government? Look what's happening with digital health. This is forced to happen, and healthcare, in the education system. So at the municipal level, we're just scratching the surface on where we can go. But I can tell you a couple of things I've been thinking about. What if people can work at home more readily and more effectively. What are the barriers now for people with physical disabilities to be able to work for an employer like a municipal government, where maybe the buildings and facilities can't all be retrofitted to accommodate everybody, but it could be if somebody's from home? What about people with young children? That the barrier with health, with daycare and all this, and look at what the evolution that's been happening, good and bad. There's some real learnings to be had there for different levels of government, but also perhaps for businesses. So when we turn our eye to the local economy and provincial economy, my heart is heavy for everybody that's impacted, first by the health implications, but two is the business people. You're the economic engines for the province, and you pay the taxes and all the taxes we use to provide services. So we want the heartbeat of our city to come back, the heartbeat of our province to come back. It's got to be done with all due respect to health procedures and directives from the chief medical officer. But we've got to find out how we can start to collectively put our energy, brain, and our passions towards getting back to our new normal. And I'm really looking forward to some of the statements or ideas and questions that will come out of this morning to really encourage us to think big, to think bold, be reasonable, obviously, but let's be really passionate about how we can get our energy back. And if it looks different, what's that going to be and how do we drive towards it? So that's enough for me today. I'm just really excited to be part of this and to listen to the experts and the people speaking. So have a good day, everybody.
Thank you very much, Mayor. Moving right along, I'm going to turn it over to David Campbell, who is the president of Jupia Consultants and a well-known economist across the province. David is going to be sharing some slides with us through his presentation, so I'll ask my colleague to cue the slide up, and we will turn it over to David.
Thank you, Adam. Appreciate the opportunity to be with you this morning and to talk a little bit about the economic implications of this pandemic and think a little bit more future-oriented about what might the response be and what might we see from an economic perspective in the months and years ahead. So I do have a few slides. So the first thing I'd like to talk to you about is what the trajectory of the economy was before we hit COVID-19. And as I think many people on the call will know, we have been in a period of relatively slow growth across the province. There is some difference depending on where you go around the province, but average annual real gross domestic product growth in the last few years since the last recession has only averaged about 0.5%. And if you go back to the period before that, going all the way back to 1992, the average annual growth rate of the economy was 2.5%. So we went from 2.5 to 0.5 after the last recession. There's a number of reasons for that related to the labor market, the lack of investment, natural resources development, and so on. And if you look sort of pre-COVID, most economists were still forecasting relatively weak growth, somewhere around 0.5% to 1% growth on an annual basis moving forward because of these structural demographic challenges and other issues related to our economy. I was a little more bullish, and if you look at the bottom half of this slide, I did see green shoots in the economy before we hit COVID-19. We had a record level of immigrants in 2019, 6,000 permanent residents were slated to settle in our province in 2019. That's a 64% increase just in 2 years. So very positive momentum there. And ultimately, if we can address our population and demographic challenges by attracting migrants to our region, that really does change the dynamic in terms of our demographic profile and ultimately our economic profile. If you look at the number of international students that are study permits issued by IRCC, that's up by 51% just in 2 years, seeing a lot more community college students coming from outside the country. So very positive trend there. Business investment was starting to turn around, had a relatively good year in 2019. Population growth, after a long period of flat growth, we did see in the last few years a modest growth, about 3% growth between the first quarter of 2016 and the first quarter of 2020, or about 19,000. So that certainly is a positive trend. And then crucially, the workforce actually started to expand again in 2019. So if you want to flip to the next slide. So this is, we have some problem. I did send you guys the PDF just in case the PowerPoint got a little wonky on us. But basically what this is showing us is that back in 2006, we had 745,000 people in the population, and that sort of percolated along a bit, but we did start to see, as we started to attract more immigrants in 2015, 2016, and 2017 through to 2019, we did see the population rising again, and now we're up to just under 780,000 population as of 2019. So if you want to flip to the next slide. So this is workforce growth, and again, just a little formatting challenge there, but I'll walk you through this. Basically, we saw slow but steady growth in the workforce through 2008. Then it kind of flattened off. You can see the bars there flattening off around 395, 394. And then we started to see a decline in the workforce as more people started to retire and leave the workforce, and we actually bottomed out around 2017. And again, I believe very much related to our increase in immigration, we started to see a rise again in 2018 and 2019. And so we're not back to our peak workforce of 2013, but we're heading in the right direction. So really, this is all about population mobility and about ensuring that we have enough workers to take the jobs that are on offer in communities around the province. If you want to go to the next slide. It's also important to note that much of the employment growth in recent years has been related to the public sector. So this is, you could pick different time frames, but just looking at 2015 to 2019, there's been an increase in healthcare and social assistance employment by about 8,700 over that period. Now this is labor force survey numbers, so there is a margin of error in there, but just basically to show you the direction of travel here. Public administration up 2,000. A pretty good growth in agricultural employment. That's a good trend. And then some other sectors, manufacturing has actually seen an increase in employment across the province between 2015 and 2019. But the real message here is that the bulk of employment growth since 2015 has been primarily in the public sector, and that's an issue we need to understand when we're thinking about our economy. If you want to flip to the next slide. So this is the immigrant numbers that I was talking about earlier. So in 2016, we brought in 1,700 refugees. A big share of those were Syrian refugees. So if you take out that one-time surge in refugees, the trend line is basically growth every year since 2015, culminating in 2019 at 6,000, and the provincial government has mused about 10,000. I believe we need even more than that in the next few years to offset the demographic challenges, but certainly this is a very positive trend for our province. Fredericton in many ways has led the way in terms of immigrant attraction in recent years, and it has been a very, very positive trend for the province. And then next slide, please. So just looking at how will COVID-19 affect the economy in the short term. Now, it's very important to understand that most of us are still trying to process this and trying to understand what these impacts could be. A lot of it has to do, of course, with when the economy comes back online. We could possibly be coming back online, at least in stages in this province, in the next couple of weeks. And certainly that changes the dynamic from something that might be 2 more months or 3 more months or 6 more months. But basically what we know for sure is that unemployment did rise significantly in April. We don't have those numbers. We will have a better look at that from Stats Canada the first week of May. But we know that about 50,000 people took advantage of that $900 grant that the province offered through the Red Cross. So that as one proxy for the unemployment situation, because those folks would be on top of any other folks that were already, let's say, collecting employment insurance. So you're looking at a very large number relative to the size of the population. I would say, though, and others have mentioned this, we are more reliant on the public sector in this province. And so that buffers us a bit, but even also public pensions. So if you look at the share of all tax filers that report Canada Pension Plan income, 34%, or over 1 out of every 3 people that filed taxes in this province reported Canada Pension Plan income in 2017 versus 27% nationally. So if you have more people on the public payroll and more people receiving public pensions, that buffers you a bit relative to other jurisdictions in terms of the impact of COVID-19 in the short term. We have seen a large influx of government cash, and we expect to see more as businesses start to take advantage of federal programs in particular. So I have not estimated what that will be, but that will easily be in the hundreds of millions of dollars across the economy. So that will limit the impact somewhat, certainly won't eliminate it entirely. And then it's important to understand, as we've all thought about, that certain sectors will be hit especially hard. If you look at restaurants, personal services, and retail in particular. But I think we have to understand that a number of our export sectors have been hit as well. The business services sector, many of the folks working in that sector across the province, their firms have actually seen a reduction in activity. If you think about air travel, so there was a surge in call activity, canceling flights and that type of thing, but now there's a lot less actual activity in terms of people making reservations and so on. If you look at the manufacturing sector, a number of our manufacturing sectors have taken somewhat of a hit. If you think about fish processing, we've delayed the lobster season as one example, and even information technology. I've talked to the folks in that sector, and a number have either had contracts suspended or other challenges related to that work in the short term. So it's certain that certain sectors will be hurt more than others. If you want to flip to the next slide. So what's interesting, though, is that the Conference Board of Canada is actually predicting a 3.3% decline in our GDP this year. So that's actually a fairly significant decline. It may not seem like much, but it is. That would be the largest average annual decline in GDP that we've seen in our lifetimes and well before that. But they're suggesting that it will come back by 4.8% in 2021. So literally offsetting the decline that we saw with a larger growth rate in 2021, and then back into that routine of around 1% per year moving forward. So what the Conference Board is suggesting in those numbers is that we won't see any long-term effects, at least in terms of the GDP impacts. They've also forecasted employment, and they're also not predicting a big loss of employment as a result of COVID-19. So they are only one voice here, but they are a good voice. They are a very well-respected forecasting agency for the country, and they are predicting not a tremendous amount of carnage for New Brunswick. So certainly in the quarters that we're in right now, the second quarter and possibly the third quarter, but over the course of the year, they're actually projecting we'll be back on track easily in 2021. I'll have a little bit more on that in a minute. Others are more pessimistic, as I've said, but few are actually predicting any kind of economic collapse. So the questions we're trying to grapple with now is how quickly will consumer spending rebound? Will people be reluctant to spend money after the economy opens, and how quickly will they come back? The retail sector, for example, in the US is predicting a big rebound in the third quarter. So we'll have to see if that will happen. What sectors will take much longer? If you think about restaurants and other sectors, I think that's something that we have to consider very carefully. And then I think we have to look at short-term opportunities. And I know many people are doing that. I've been a big advocate for tourism. We spend more outside the province every year on tourism than people coming to our province spend every year. So technically speaking, if it was safe, and if we could do tourism within our province, you could actually see even a larger amount of spending on tourism this summer than otherwise would have been the case, because we can't leave and nobody can come in. Therefore, that might be an opportunity for tourism. Of course, manufacturing, we've seen several manufacturers step up and take contracts related to personal protective equipment and other types of activities that are related to the short term here. And then the service economy as well. Just moving on, because I only have 8 minutes here and I want to get through this. Normalcy will depend on the extent of any fundamental shifts. So if you think about longer term, will we see fundamental shifts in consumer habits in the workforce and business processes? So the mayor mentioned earlier about working from home. That will be something we'll have to see. If you look at government deficits, they will have to be addressed. So that will impact us possibly harder than other provinces that are less reliant on government. My question would be, will small and medium-sized enterprises become more resilient? So I was surprised to find out that so many businesses only had a few weeks of cash flow. In other words, they could not last more than a month or two on the credit lines and the capital buffers that they have in their business. So that's very interesting. If we look forward, will we find ways for our SMEs to be more resilient and have a little bit more of a runway if and when this happens again? Tourism will take longer to rebound. The cruise ship industry is one example. Critically for this in province will be the impact on immigration and international students, and also international exports. We are a big exporter internationally, food, oil, refined oil products, forest products, and so on. And I do think there will be a drive for more self-sufficiency. So the extent of that we'll have to see, but there has been a lot of musings among politicians and leaders about our ability to be more self-sufficient. The question is that self-sufficiency for New Brunswick in terms of food, medical equipment, and so on, or is that Canada-wide? So if you want to flip to the next slide, I think I only have one or maybe two more. I think one here. So what economic trends will COVID-19 accelerate in the province? Well, I think there's a lot of, if you've been following it as I have, everybody's saying fundamental change. Some are saying almost no change. I think we don't know that. It depends on the extent of what I would call the lingering effects, or what others have called the dance. So as we try to keep from this pandemic coming back or rebounding, how will that impact the economy? My initial prediction is that we will have modest but not fundamental change in consumer habits, in workforce activity, and business processes. So that's my initial projection. Telework will expand, but we already have the shortest commute times in Canada here in New Brunswick, and I think people do like to congregate for work. They like to have a separate place where they work, many people. So I think it won't be as big a deal here. It might be a bigger deal in larger urban centers. I'm very hopeful that our immigration numbers will rebound, and I think if other jurisdictions decide to pull back on immigration, that will be our opportunity to actually step in and accelerate what we're trying to do in this region. Smaller urban centers, and I know Herb Emery has been thinking about this, but smaller urban centers and rural communities could be better positioned for growth moving forward. So that's a very interesting part of this narrative. If you think about the fact that pandemics tend to be more associated with the larger urban centers because of the proximity of people, because of the international flows, maybe we could argue that smaller urban centers like St. John or Fredericton might be better off, and even rural or smaller communities could be better off or positioned for growth post-COVID. So I think that's the last slide I have, I believe, and I'll turn it back over to Adam for further discussion.
Great. Thank you very much for that presentation, David. We are going to move right into the presentation from Dr. Emery. However, I want to remind folks that they can submit questions through the chat box at the bottom of your screen. I see some have come in. We will take a quick break after Dr. Emery's presentation to field some of those questions. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Herb Emery, who is the Vaughn Chair in Regional Economics at the University of New Brunswick, to share his thoughts.
Hey, can everyone hear me okay? So David's given a very great practical presentation, so I'm going to go the other way and be not so helpful and practical, but try to put things in terms of larger forces or larger concepts to think about. Some of the questions coming up on the chat do sort of tie into that a bit, and it's going to be about challenges and opportunities. So an interesting thing to observe is that we're only about 6 weeks into this lockdown, maybe 8 weeks, depending how you count. And if you think it's hard now, when we get into some of these disruptions, historically, they can last up to 10 years. And so if you think about this language about it's a marathon, not a sprint, we're already exhausted and we barely crossed the start line. So we have to start thinking differently about what's our ultimate goal, where we're headed with this. So one thing to think about is we've been dealing with a supply side disruption, that the hope for a quick recovery comes from the belief that we had to shut down to deal with a public health crisis, but once that resolves itself, if it's quick enough, we still have the spending power and demand still exists to return to business as usual. The longer this goes and the more we get households that start to get strained and lose access to credit, and the more we lose export markets to disrupted international trade, we start to run into a different type of problem, which is more like the Great Depression, which is a demand side disruption, which we have much less control over as a small open economy. So the double whammy is we start with a supply side shock, which has been severe and hard, and the government's been doing a great job dealing with that. But we're about to move into a second problem, which is how do we keep our market share up and how do we keep our incomes going when people don't have as much money to spend and the world may not be producing as much, so may not want as much as what we have to offer. The other way to think about the effect of the long run effect of this pandemic is if you think about 9/11, the cost of doing everything is about to go up and the price you get for everything is about to go down. So there's going to be a pretty severe squeeze just coming from business as usual costs if we don't figure out new models for business or new ways of doing things. If we remain people dependent for production and tight quarters, that's going to be a pretty tough way to produce. If you follow Cargill out in Alberta, they have several hundred cases now in meatpacking because they remain dependent on a model of production that was very people intensive and putting them in close quarters. And we all have to recognize that we're to blame because we like the cheap beef that came out of that model. And so if we want safer supply chains, we're going to have to start paying for worker safety and different models of production. And if we really thought that that was important before, we should be asking ourselves, why didn't we do it? Why is it taking this to show us the risks that are there? And this is the lesson that's going to come out of the pandemic, is that we have opted to take lower prices of travel, of goods, and everything else over protecting ourselves from the risk of this kind of shock. And so what we're really good at, it turns out, is fighting fires. And if we just put a bit more effort into preventing them, we wouldn't have to be as good at fighting them, because fighting fires is really expensive compared to just not having them happen. So with the changes that are coming, we're going to have to take a look at how we do everything and see if what we're doing is even sustainable. And if you think about New Brunswick, the focus on jobs as a policy target over time has probably left us with more labor dependence in a lot of the ways we produce. We haven't taken advantage of digital technologies to the extent other places have been. We haven't taken advantage of automation to the extent other places will be. And so when we start to think about what's coming, we're going to look at a big transformation in just how business is done, how things are produced. And we have to ask ourselves, are we as a province ready to support producers and service providers that want to go that direction? Or are we basically going to keep using things like EI so that we remain dependent on a labor-dependent mode of production? So when we get into what are the new opportunities emerging, there's some big trends that economists are talking about. One is there's going to be an increased concentration of production. So think big guys are getting bigger, small guys are going to disappear. We're going to be seeing higher fixed costs of producing under the public health work regulations, and we're going to see reduced overall demand. So the expectation is we're going to see a shakeout, we're going to see concentration of activity, and it's not clear that it's going to stay in the same place. And it's not clear that we're going to rely less on trade because the price of everything goes up. If it's still cheaper to import, we may be turning in those directions. And so we need to think about that trend. When we talk about re-regionalization of supply chains, that's an opportunity. But we also have to make sure that as we're integrated into supply chains already, we have to worry about, are we on the periphery of that chain or are we moving close to the center? Closer to the center means you have a better chance of hanging around. If you're on the far end of that supply chain, you're the marginal producer, you get turned on and off as you need it. And so we need to do a better mapping of that. Increased digitalization and automation of goods production. The main feeling is people are just too risky to rely on in a pandemic because if you get an outbreak, you'll be shut down. So a lot of companies with the means to do it are making pretty abrupt changes in just the layout of where workers are located, what practices are in place, what PPE they can provide them. That isn't going to be available to all sizes of companies. So SMEs might face a very different challenge trying to move into this higher fixed cost of producing. And so we're going to need government programs or government tax systems that are more sensitive to the full costs of producing that are coming online and making sure that those kinds of things are affordable. So in the short run, the opportunity and the risk for New Brunswick is we're going to have contestable market share. That as some companies withdraw from the region or we're relying less on China, there's going to be more demand in the region to produce something. But it's not necessarily going to happen here unless companies think that there's a value proposition of producing from New Brunswick. So we can gain market share in companies, or we can lose companies as other places do a better job of attracting businesses out. We have a large ecosystem of small and medium producers. If that's the shakeout that's coming as things get larger, we have to be worried about that. What are we going to do for small and medium-sized enterprises if we think that they're valuable going forward to keep? And I want to point out that before we went into this crisis, there were already provinces like Alberta that were cutting loose startups, particularly in IT, because they decided the cost of carrying them was getting too high. Now that they have no money from oil, you're going to see more dramatic things being shut off. So we also have to keep aware that there's going to be some footloose companies that may want to move as well that might be a good bet for New Brunswick to take on if we want to play in that market. For services, we know that the customers are out there, but we need a business model to reach them. So if you think about what could be going on with fitness clubs, there's a lot of ads right now for these digitally networked biking programs and these creepy mirrors that someone comes on and cheers you along. So as we move to more distance and more virtual, there are people who are figuring out different ways of reaching customers, and subscription models are really the kind of thing that are coming in. So if you think Netflix, a lot of services that we've been paying a la carte, you might start to see a lot of us getting locked up in our regular service delivery on a subscription. And these models have been tried from time to time with co-op farmers and things like that, and they'd work well on a small scale. But I think what we may be looking at is a big shakeout in just business models for services, and whoever figures that out, who can get the cost of doing things down and figure out a way to reach their customers, they're going to gain market share at the expense of traditional business. Amazon's already done it to us, so we know how this works. But now how do you do this on a more localized basis where it's more of the non-tradables in a sense? The biggest opportunity of all is that pandemics are rarely solved by vaccines and medical breakthroughs or treatments. They're resolved by information. And information guides behavioral change. And if you look at most of the great pandemics historically, they've been resolved well before the vaccine comes in, just because people figured out how to communicate with the public about what to do and what practices were in place. So if you can help information products in a way of tracking, if you look at what's happening in China, Canadians aren't comfortable with the human rights aspects of having to show a certificate that you're healthy. But if there is a way to certify that someone is a low risk or capable to go in, you start to open up opportunities to do things again. And that's going to be a complicated one to do in Canada, because we're going to have a much bigger fight over the ethics than I think they had in China. But if you can resolve that information thing with an IT product, you've created a new market opportunity for this region. For best practices in pandemics, I think we should be really disappointed in Canada overall in preparedness for what we're in now. It's not like this is the first outbreak of anything between SARS to H1N1. We've had lots of warnings to do things. We've had lots of warnings to get prepared, and we didn't do it. So we have to look other places for best practice. And I would argue cybersecurity is the best model that we've had, because they've been dealing with effectively this kind of viral transmission and ability to shut things down. If you look at their education and training products, the providing hygiene effectively for firms to keep their digital networks healthy. And again, through the pandemic, we're going to have increased cybersecurity risk anyway as we go more digital and virtual. So we should be looking at the cybersecurity guys for lessons about how would they recommend managing some of these transmission or keeping people safe, information versus products and things like that. Agriculture for years has had to defend against outbreaks of agricultural plant-based and animal-based diseases. And most of us don't pay attention to the customs declarations where we say we haven't been on a farm recently, but we have models in place for industries like agriculture that we could be looking at. With COVID, we have a problem of density of humans and more rapid transmission, but the models and practices are out there. And if you think about how far away we are from the start line on this, in February, I flew on a plane next to someone who was coughing and sneezing for 2 hours to Toronto. 2 weeks before the outbreak was a big deal. So the fact that we let people get on planes when they were sick because it was too expensive to tell them you can't fly today tells you the trade-off we were willing to make before it became perceived to be too deadly. And we don't have the culture to say, wear a mask when you go on a flight. We've been packing people in like sardines because we wanted the low costs. So we have to shift our culture away from low cost, low price to something that actually pays for the full risk and prevention that we're going to go towards. We didn't organize our healthcare system towards public health, community-based care, and surveillance. That was a big lesson coming out of 2009. We should not have been caught in this situation if we had taken those lessons to move away from the hospitals into the community, better education about how to deal with this. And instead, once it resolved itself, we decided no big deal, we'll wait again. And now we see COVID and we say, oh, it's a black swan. We couldn't have predicted this. Every 10 years, you see the prediction, we've got another one coming. So are we going to do anything differently this time? The other thing to remember, everyone's talking about vaccines. We don't even have people getting the seasonal flu vaccine when it's free. And that one's even a big killer. So the fact that it didn't kill enough should tell us culturally we have a bit of an issue with how we feel about some of these best practices. So consistent with what David's saying, what would we expect to be different in a few years' time? Our risk is, let's suppose in the short run, we agree to more restrictive rules for flying and it raises the cost. We might hit a point where there's no serious outbreak or we're through the third wave and people start demanding, why do I have to wear a mask? Why does there have to be an empty seat beside me? It would be cheaper if we get rid of those, and the pressure will be to move back. And so we have to think about what other practices could we bring in the meantime to sort of protect us against the return to what we would call the old normal. Things like spitting on the streets been coming up. We have a snack food called Spits where you see teenagers spitting them all over. If you go back to the tuberculosis outbreak, one of the first lessons was don't spit in the street. But that's how far we seem to regress on all these things. Adam, how much time do I have? I think I'm running out.
I think you're running out.
Yeah, so I'll just leave it there. There was a question about what could we be doing with the ecosystem. The only thing I want to finish with is that the governments have done a terrific job dealing with the first crisis, the supply side shock. And my hope is that they're moving more towards planning for the next stage of coming out. And I don't think they're going to have any money in a year to do much. So they're going to have to think differently about how they can support business and households coming out of this. So the first one will be start giving us definition of regulations and protocols that we need to operate and mingle socially. So what do we have to prepare for as households and businesses? Give us a clear time horizon for how long you can actually support business so it's realistic. So if you tell business now you've got 3 months, that's going to lead to different behavior by business than you've got a year. And the fact that we're pretty confident with Alberta's meltdown, the demands on government is going up. So the watering hole is getting smaller, so help us get to the other side. And then be honest and clear about priorities and triage for government services programs and priorities for maintaining business. In the United States, you'll start to see there's a lot of discussion about letting small business go. The belief is you can kill it and it will grow back, but if you lose your big companies, they're gone for good. So the economists are pretty cold-hearted in the US. They're basically saying, forget about small and medium. The future is going to be in keeping your big exporters. So if that's the priority in Canada, you at least ethically owe it to business to tell them, are you a priority going forward or are you on your own? Because that will lead to very different decisions being made. So I'll cut it off there. It's just so I don't take too much time.
Great. Well, that's very insightful, Herb. Thank you very much. We only probably have time for one question. I see there seems to be a lot of interest on immigration and population growth, and I'm going to do my best to synthesize a few questions. David, I'll ask you to start, and then Herb, maybe you can add if there is anything you want to add to it. I think what we're seeing is obviously, immigration and migration is shut down right now, but are there things that New Brunswick should be doing to prepare for once those restrictions are lifted, and what is the potential for continued population growth as we started to see trending at the beginning of your presentation?
So I think just quickly, I think the fundamental demographic situation hasn't changed. So if we want to grow, we're going to have to attract people. Over 90% of provincial government tax revenue, own source tax revenue, comes off of income. So if you're not growing your income, and you can grow that through productivity in other ways, but if you're not growing your income, it's very, very hard to see how government can sustainably fund public services. So I fundamentally believe we will have to significantly increase our immigrant numbers it does make it complicated. Even if we lift these restrictions, the COVID-19 is not going away anytime soon. So we'll have to figure that out. And I think we need clear rules and a clear approach from government on how to do that. But I still think fundamentally we need to turn that tap back on. We will see higher than expected unemployment in certain sectors, possibly food service and others. So we'll have to keep our eye on that and try to understand what that dynamic is. But fundamentally, our demographic situation hasn't changed. Thousands of people will retire every year, and we need replacements in the workforce. So that would be how I would answer that question.
Thank you. Anything to add on that, Herb?
Just to point out that there's two sides to the immigration piece. One is how much do Canadians want more immigration? I have a concern that with sort of more isolationist tendencies in a severe recession, that Canadians will try to restrict the flow in the short run. But on the other side, in talking to some of my research team who are from overseas, they're saying their countries are telling people not to go now. They're trying to keep their labor supply local. And in part, the hostility towards the Trump-type rhetoric is starting to drive immigrants away from North America. And if we don't have the opportunities that overcome that sort of negativity, it's going to be hard to attract them in the short run. So again, if we're a welcoming place, we might do better than if we're seen as part of the chorus saying we're fine as we are and we're keeping jobs for Canadians.
Great, thank you very much. So we are going to move forward into the panel section of our discussion. Before we do, just a quick reminder that if we did not get to your question, we will be following up individually with those, and that David and Herb are going to stay on the call. So if we have further questions for them, we'll try to get to those questions in the panel discussion. Just to quickly introduce our panelists, we first have Larry Shaw, who is the CEO of Ignite Fredericton, Knowledge Park, and Planet Hatch with us. We also have Krista Hahn, who is a managing partner at Grant Thornton. We have Pat Whalen, who's the president and CEO at Lumen Ultra, a local Fredericton-based company. Mike Melvin, who is a partner at McInnes Cooper. And Louis Bernachette, who is the chief actuary for Hub International National Group Consulting. My first question, I'll start and ask Larry to answer. Larry, based on available data, how has the COVID-19 impacted small and medium-sized enterprises in New Brunswick? And then what are economic development, other business support agencies doing to help right now?
Well, good morning. Thanks, Adam. And it's always going to be really hard to follow both Herb and Dave. Let me add some additional context to some of their comments, though, that I think leads into sort of the question of what can economic development organizations do. So, if you look just in the near term, the COVID impact, as an example, in surveying some of our businesses here, 95% of the businesses would say that they have been either severely affected or affected by COVID. So, it's almost exclusively all of business. At the same time, those same businesses surveyed, about 60% of them had already implemented layoffs. So there had been a labor impact already. And when you put that in context, I think with some other conditions that we've been working with or trying to deal with or address, there's some reports that would say somewhere around 75% of the small and medium enterprises in Canada are going to change hands within the next 10 years. In New Brunswick alone, we've got sort of identified somewhere in the 150,000 number where we're going to have people occupying new employee IDs at companies. So we're going to have 150,000 new workers coming in to fill the jobs that are being vacated. So and we just recently, as a region being New Brunswick and Atlantic Canada, we just recently turned, as David highlighted, positive in terms of population growth. So now when you look at what's happening from some of what David's highlighted and Herb, we're looking at potentially somewhere around a $3.5 billion impact to tax and tax revenues and things like that. So one could say, well, my gracious, let's just fold our arms and let's let the wave take us over. And I mention these things not to suggest that there's more negativity. I think this really highlights the actual positive that's coming from this. When you look at restaurants, it was mentioned that restaurants are going to be one of the severely impacted businesses. Absolutely, we see it every day. But when you look at what they're doing, how do they move into things like curbside pickup? How they're re-engineering their work is exactly, I think, what we want to look for coming out of COVID. I've often said, I don't want us to go back to the normal. I really don't. I don't want us to go back to what we were doing yesterday and call that good. I think we should be going back to, what worked well and take a new normal and paint what that is. And that's exactly what the entrepreneurs that we're seeing are doing. Not to underscore the seriousness of what's going on. When you're waking up every day as an entrepreneur trying to figure out how do you simply pay for your rent or pay for your product, your base products, and how do you keep employees, and how do you cover things like unemployment insurance costs and workers' compensation costs, all those things that the chamber does a great job in terms of representing their membership. But instead of folding their arms, those entrepreneurs are looking for solutions. They're looking for ways to move forward. And some of those ways, we've seen companies do that curbside pickup. We've seen companies, running manufacturing plants, trying to figure out how do you do social separation on an assembly line, and what does that do to your overall operating costs. So there are those entrepreneurs out there that are trying to shift and move through this, and I think that's the highlight. And I don't think we're going to go back to a normal. I think the new normal is going to be something that's a lot richer than what our old normal has been. It will take us great pain and time to get there. A 10-year cycle is probably not too much. So that brings me to sort of, the main question that you rose, Adam, in what is it that the economic development organizations can do? And I think the first thing they can do is to ensure that all of our partners, all of the people that we work with on a regular basis are aligned. So the work here in Fredericton that we do with the Chamber, or Bio New Brunswick, or the agencies, we have an agencies meeting locally where all of the downtown business units and Northside, et cetera, get together and try to figure out what's the best path forward on a lot of things. So there's got to be total alignment when we work on that. I think there's the near-term damage control. And as an example, our team, when you look at the workload, we've reprioritized everything. We're not doing anything today the same as we were doing yesterday, or not much. All of our programs have been moved virtually. During the first few days and the first few weeks of the impact here, we've helped, or we sit down on one-on-one sessions with about 200 companies in a region. And those questions are in some cases, help me understand what the province or the feds are doing in terms of programs. They've done a great job in getting programs out, but man, I'll tell you, it's not an easy process to try to figure out which one is the best for you to utilize. So we've got to really make sure that we're doing damage control. And I think that phase is sort of coming to an end, quite frankly, because businesses have moved to where they're going to move. They understand what their challenges are, and they're either got a gap to close it, or in some cases, unfortunately, some businesses are not going to survive. Then as I mentioned, alignment of the resources. And the last piece that I think that economic development organizations need to look at, we always have to have a vision to the future. Even though we may be drowning and we may be suffering significant issues, we can't lose sight of the future, because it's the future that's going to give us some indication what we need to do now to get there. So when we look at the the research and development capabilities, we often brag about the University of New Brunswick. 75% of the research and development happens right here in our back door. We have a natural innovation district here in Fredericton. We're somewhere in the magnitude of 60 research and organizations are within a 2-kilometer radius. So when we look at those, we need to double down on that investment. We need to double down on things like cybersecurity. Herb mentioned that. That's, this is a time where cybersecurity is actually going to have more demand than it would have been, post-COVID. I think in some of the early days of COVID, we saw significant increases in phishing, exercises with cyber, where they were using COVID-19 as the cover. I think we have to look at things like, like if you just look at the healthcare system, if we go back to, filling up our emergency rooms, and we go back to, going to an emergency room to have a prescription refilled instead of rethinking how we deliver health services, we need to move forward on digital health. We need to move forward on digital education. All of those things that we've seen other jurisdictions around the world move ahead of us. We need to not be the worst child in the school. We need to make sure that we are investing in those things. I saw a note by on one of the chat questions about our rural capabilities and internet. we moved from an environment 25 years ago where we were the leading jurisdiction in North America for IT investments. We're no longer that. We need to get back to some of those elements. We need to make sure bandwidth in rural areas, is the same as in cities. And we can't be paying $250 or $150 for those services in the rural areas. I'm probably out of time, Adam. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Larry. Very quickly, moving along to Pat. Pat, obviously, Lumen Ultra has received national attention and prominence for what you are doing with an opportunity within COVID-19. Hoping that you can speak to the other entrepreneurs on the call about how you identify those opportunities and how the other entrepreneurs may be able to look forward to opportunities in this new normal. And then just speaking to your role as a leader in the business community and specifically for Lumen Ultra, how you've managed to work through, the operational, HR, financial changes to your company during this current crisis.
Sure, yeah. So first question first, Adam, as far as, what we have been doing, basically, when the Prime Minister issued his call to action on March 20th, within about an hour, we were responding and working our way through federal government channels to determine where we could potentially help. And within about a day, we were in contact with the Public Health Agency of Canada, essentially telling them, look, we can make tests that can test directly for COVID-19 at our factory in Fredericton, as well as our factories in Baltimore and in Holland as well. Tell us what you need. Let's see if our expertise can be brought to bear, because the reality is we have been developing and selling tests like this for the past 20 plus years, just in international markets outside of Canada and in different applications outside of clinical. And in working with those folks at PHAC out in Winnipeg, we came to the conclusion that Lumen Ultra had the potential to be able to make a huge difference in shoring up that testing supply chain. And that resulted in the Prime Minister's announcement last week, which, by the way, he scooped us. He announced it many days earlier than any of us had anticipated, and we kind of had to play catch up with him, but I guess that's the prerogative when you're the Prime Minister. We've ramped up this testing, and we're now supplying the reagents to be able to do tests across Canada and a little bit more on top of what the current capacity is. And that capacity is going to continue to expand now that that has been debottlenecked. So, it's great to be able to do that. So how do we do that? Well, we have a kind of like Liam Neeson in Taken. We have a very particular set of skills that turned out to be something that could be brought to bear in this situation. And I think all of us have the opportunity to play a role. But one, anecdotal thing that I will tell you is if you simply fill out the form on the internet that they advertise and just wait for them to get back to you, you're going to be left wanting. Because right at the start of this webinar, I had a call from Public Works who was following up on the submission that we made at 9 a.m. on March 21st. And everything has changed since that time. You have to be tenacious. You have to speak your mind. You have to get in contact with as many people as possible. I mean, that weekend, I probably spoke to about 120 people with the federal government. And it took that many people for me to find the right person to be able to talk to and truly understand what it was that Lumen Ultra could bring to bear in this battle. So the biggest piece of advice I would give to entrepreneurs is that if you strongly believe you can make a difference, it could be anything from hand sanitizers to people in China that might be able to get masks or anything else, you got to be tenacious. You have to get out there. Don't expect people to get back to you. You have to push and push and push and push. Because that's not because the federal government doesn't care. It's because their hair is on fire every single day. They have 18 different priorities in any given moment, and you really have to be at the right place at the right time with the right person to be able to get your message across. So that really was the key to success for us. It was brute force in being able to get in contact with the right people. How we have managed our business, just very briefly. On the week of March 16th, as the world started changing very rapidly, at the time, social distancing was the name of the game. Now it's called physical distancing. We typically will have 75% of our staff on site and 25% off site. We made a pivot, basically flipped that around, where we had 75% now off site, 25% on site. We're a manufacturing company at our core. Shutting down completely and sending everybody home is not an option, because 100% of our core customer base are essential services: drinking water plants, sewage treatment plants, oil refineries, pulp and paper mills, you name it. All of those places keep operating, and they rely on our products every single day. So we had to make that flip and that pivot, and then install all of the necessary controls to ensure that we had adequate physical distancing for the safety of our on-site staff, who have been fantastic through this whole thing. Implemented, maximum personal protective equipment, N95 masks, gloves, everything that would be possibly needed. Luckily, we use those things every single day in our operations. So we had a supply, and with our international supply chain, we were able to shore that supply up very quickly. The hardest part in all of this is simply maintaining engagement. We've got a staff of close to 100 people. And like I say, 75% of them normally are on site. How do you keep people engaged? Well, we're a very digital company. We basically flipped all of our daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly meetings to be 100% virtual. Even if you were on site, you're not being in the same room with another person. Find another room, find another workstation. Everybody participates virtually. We have had weekly contests. We have what we call the Ministry of Fun in Microsoft Teams, which is just a general chat channel for our staff to engage. We have virtual happy hours. We started those up last week. We're continuing those every Friday moving forward, keeping everybody engaged. We're lucky we have a great team made up of the large majority of them are New Brunswickers. And we are all in the mindset that we're going to do everything that we can to be able to operate our company safely for maximum impact in the fight against COVID. And the last thing I will say is that, as we're pursuing the opportunities that we're pursuing with the Canadian government and other market opportunities related to COVID-19, we're running into restrictions from a standpoint of the throughput, the production capacity that we have. We've essentially optimized our core operations to squeeze every little bit out of that we possibly can. And as a consequence, we're in the process of building a new facility because the reality is we just can't squeeze more people into the room and get more hands doing more things. You have to maintain adequate distancing, and it's an investment you have to make in getting more space, more equipment, more people. And that's something that we're doing right now and we'll be doing for the next couple of months. So it's been a whirlwind, just like all of us have gone through a significant amount of change over the past while. We are very lucky in that we can make such a big difference in the battle against COVID-19, but I think all of us can play a role. And the thing that I would, re-emphasize is, if you believe you can make a difference, be tenacious, speak up and find the right people to talk to. Don't just float an email out into cyberspace and expect a return, because you're probably going to be left wanting.
Thanks, Pat. That's a very useful information, and I think that I can speak for all of us on the call that you're certainly making us all proud, you and the team at Lumen Ultra. Krista, I'm going to be moving to you next. Obviously, the financial considerations will depend from, sector to sector, firm to firm, but hoping that you could start by giving some general advice on the financial aspects entrepreneurs should be thinking about right now. And then the medium to long-term considerations. Obviously, a number of government programs, and that may provide the short-term relief, but over, an annual or, the next 6 quarters, what should entrepreneurs be thinking about?
Thanks, Adam. I'm going to start out with quickly 2 quotations. The first one, I don't even know who to attribute it to, but we've all heard it before: cash is king. And then the other one I'm going to say, it's an Eisenhower quote, and it is, plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. Okay, so, and here's what I'm going to tell you. So in terms of what do you need to do, the top thing you need to do in terms of readiness right now, and something that I think that is required for the medium and the longer term, is going to be your cash flow forecasting. Okay, so what I would say about that is, and why the plan is irrelevant, is because things are changing every day, right? Pat, you just did such a great job outlining that. And so, yes, it's important to do that plan, And within 24 to 36 to 48 hours, that plan is out the window. What's important is that practice of planning that you do on an iterative basis to continue to plan and pivot and plan and pivot. And I can hear with everything that Pat's saying that that's what Lumen Ultra is doing. And I would extend that, Adam, you used the word entrepreneur, but what I would say is that's relevant for all organizations. And so, Larry, you spoke very eloquently about all the social development and economic organizations that help us. That's our chamber, that's our BioNB, that's our Ignite, that's everyone, right? So we all need to be figuring out how do we sustain, because it is this true, it's such a system, which of course, Dave and Herb spoke so well about too, the grander system that we all find ourselves in. So in my opinion, the best thing you can do is the planning. Yes, the output will be a cash flow plan, but the planning is what is important. And I'm just going to say 3 things about that. So the first one is when it comes to how often do that. So cadence, you need to figure out for your business, okay, is that daily? Is that weekly? I'm going to hazard a guess that monthly is not frequent enough for you to be considering that, because you need to be really dialed in. What are my cash inflows? What are my cash outflows? How am I going to manage my working capital? Okay, so some businesses have been doing this for many, many years. And I'd say that those are the ones that will be most resilient in a situation like this. It's not too late. If you have not yet started doing this cash flow forecasting, I would suggest that you commence. Many banks and other professional services organizations can help you. It can be rudimentary. I'd probably go with the KISS model. Keep it simple, okay? So the second thing I'm going to say is around sensitivity. And I often call it Goldilocks, okay? So the porridge can either be just the right temperature, or it can be too hot, or it can be too cold. When you are forecasting your cash flows, you're going to want to be, I'll say, realistic, but you also want to apply some sensitivity, okay? So you want to see, so here's what I think is going to happen. Here's my best case, and here's my worst case scenario. And then the one further step I would take is, if God forbid you find yourself in that worst case scenario bucket, start thinking about, how do I get the best case scenario out of my worst case scenario? What are the few things I can be thinking about, preparing for, proactively thinking about to prepare or mitigate what could happen in a worst case scenario situation, okay? And the third thing is around communication, and that's with your lenders. And so the importance of establishing, proactively communicating with your lenders right now, I've seen lots of names popping up who's here. I know we have lots of lenders that are here listening today. They're probably nodding vigorously, yes. So, and they'll love to see that cash flow forecasting. That's going to give them the tools and information they need to help businesses and other organizations to navigate this. And the other thing that cash flow forecast can do for you is keep you dialed in to any covenants that you might have, to keep you on side, and to help you with managing your relationship with your lender. So in my opinion, that's the most important thing to do: short term, medium term, and long term. Adam, did you want me to jump in and talk about programs right now, or did you want to move around a bit first?
I'm going to move around, and then we'll return to that, Krista. Thank you very much. Very insightful. Just as a time check, we do have about 10 minutes left, but so we'll do our best to get to questions, but we will be following up individually afterwards if you still want to put those in the chat box. Mike, I'm going to turn to you now. Similarly to Krista, I know the legal implications will vary from firm to firm. However, what is some general advice legally that entrepreneurs should be thinking about in these times?
Thanks, Adam. So, as lawyers, we deal on minimizing risk, and there's certainly plenty of risk around right now. But I think 2 key areas that businesses really should be focused on at this point is, how to minimize the risk and minimize losses from existing lines of business, and how to minimize risk as they move into new lines of business, either new modes of delivering their goods and services, or potentially new lines of business entirely, adjacent lines of business, new opportunities that arise. So, we've already been having these conversations now for a number of weeks around minimizing losses. And we've done a lot of discussions around, force majeure clauses in commercial agreements, frustration of contract. And these are legal doctrines that, in certain circumstances can relieve you from your obligations to perform a contract. So if some unexpected event arises, like COVID-19, that makes it impossible for you to perform, you can be relieved from your obligations and from the expense and the burden of that. The problem I've found with the way COVID-19 has developed is that the governments have really been at pains not to completely shut business down. So if you read the mandatory order that's been issued by the province here in New Brunswick and, reissued and restated a few times, really they've done the very minimum to sort of prevent the spread of the disease without actually shutting business down. One of the effects of this, I would say, is that in many cases, the actions they've taken haven't really made it impossible to do business, which, has the effect, not in all cases, but in many cases, of meaning that you can't really alleviate yourself from some of these contractual burdens. So you end up negotiating, right? You have to talk to your suppliers, talk to your customers, lenders, and so on, and renegotiate these arrangements. And I think it's very important to have some advice when you do this. I mean, speed is of the essence, time is of the essence right now. And so the temptation, of course, is going to be to do handshake deals, verbal deals, just get it done very quickly. And that may be okay in the short term, but I will say that in my experience, handshake deals are never a good idea, certainly not to rely on. And it's not even so much the problem with proving what the parties agreed, because usually there'll be some texts or emails. The problem is that the parties don't actually turn their minds to all the possible scenarios that could happen. So, they may agree on the basic business terms, but they don't really agree, well, what if this goes wrong? What if that goes wrong, right? Who bears the burden on this one? How do we allocate the risk on that one? And so I think you really do need proper advice to make sure that all of those scenarios have been worked through and that they've been properly documented. Otherwise, what you may end up with is the illusion of an agreement rather than an actual agreement. In terms of, minimizing risk as you sort of pivot and move into new modes of doing business or new areas of business, new lines of business, I think it's also, quite important to have advice, because particularly to the extent that you move into new areas of business, and this is happening. I mean, there are businesses making significant pivots. You may be dealing with new risks. There may be new industry standards you have to comply with. There may be new expectations in terms of, how parties in that line of business allocate risk as among themselves, right? So the contractual expectations may be different. And of course, you may be dealing with new regulatory regimes as well. So I would say that, entrepreneurs really are going to be bobbing and weaving and adapting for the foreseeable term. And speed is of the essence. These things have to be done in a quick, kind of scrappy way. But I think if you want the benefits of your actions to be reliable, really they do ultimately have to be thoroughly advised and properly documented. So those would be my major points.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike. Louis, I'm going to move to you next. Group benefits may not be a top of mind concern immediately, but I think is becoming more and more clear for entrepreneurs and business owners. So my question to you is that, in terms of group benefits, what should entrepreneurs anticipate during the immediate crisis, and then looking forward, the potential considerations that they should be preparing for medium to long term?
I'll try to be as concise as possible. Can you hear me? Yeah. Perfect. On the short term, the one thing that we're seeing right now is because of the confinement, medical and dental claims are dropping dramatically. So if you do have a medical dental plan, and Larry was mentioning before that about 60% of employers in New Brunswick have done layoffs. One of the things that we're seeing is about 50% of those employers are maintaining benefits. So the benefits are still there. Revenues for the company might not be coming in as much, but they're still providing benefits to their employees. And medical and dental are a big chunk of the premiums. And so what we've seen is obviously in April, claims have dropped. Medications are still taken. However, there's a 30-day supply. But if you think of paramedical services, if you think of just going to the doctors and getting a new prescription, that's kind of not happening. It's very slow, and a lot of services are just plainly not available. So just so you know, for medical and dental, all insurance companies have announced, started last Friday all the way to yesterday, but they all followed suit and announced a reduction of their premium for April by 8 to 10% for the medical plans, and for dental, 50 to 70% of the premiums for April. Some of them have already announced that this will extend all the way to June. Now, one note, and this is an important note, is this is good for plans that are fully insured. So there is no type of financial arrangement where you share the premium and the risk. So some of the plans will have an ASO, so self-insured. some of the other plans might be refund, that type of thing. That doesn't apply to these plans. However, you can expect that if insurance companies are willing to reduce the premiums, it means that even for your plan where you share part of the risk, you should see a decrease in your claims. And you may want to think about talking to the insurance company and see if you can still reduce your premium, knowing that your claims are going to go down. So that's what we're seeing on the short term. One thing that's interesting is what's going to happen after. Well, there's two things. We've heard about, there's a bit of uncertainty right now on the economy. On the short term and medium term, for sure. Are we going to see a short-term recession? Maybe. And this will definitely anyway have an impact on disability. So in terms of a recession, if when the unemployment goes up, and that's one thing that we expect that might happen in the next few months, often we also see disability increase. There's a study from an actuary that came out a few years ago where they looked at the last recession and saw that the incidence for disability claims went up by up to 50% in the times of a recession or when the economy wasn't doing so good. So incidence by 50% might mean that your claims, your costs are going to go 15 to 25%. And the last thing is life. So if we go back to COVID is very virulent, as you know. People die from it. However, the numbers are still quite small. There are quite a number of deaths, but if you look as a percentage of the population, it's still quite small. But that's because only about 5% of the Canadian population is, right now, that's the estimate, is about 5% actually got it. If you look at the numbers in the papers, you're going to see my numbers, that doesn't make sense, not 5%, it's way less than that. But the thing is, it is expected that 30 to 50 times what we're seeing in the news is actually the right number of people. A lot of people are getting it without symptoms or very few symptoms, so never get tested, and they're not immune to it. So that means about 5% of Canadians had it. And look at the number of deaths. And before we get out of that COVID, we need about 70% of the population to have it. So the numbers of death is probably going to go up, and that will also have an impact on your group benefits. Right now, your premium is set, your rate is set, but for life and LTD, expect that these two rates will go up over the next few years. So it might be smart to look at how you can lock in that rate, or maybe lock it in for a couple of years with the current company, or even go to market. So that's my few notes on the group benefits.
Excellent. Thank Louis. And, vitally important info that's probably not getting as much attention as it should right now. We only have about 30 seconds left, but Krista, I'm going to turn it back to you. Maybe you can give us a synopsis, the good, the bad, and the ugly of the government assistance programs.
Yep. So super quickly, obviously everyone's aware there are a significant amount of federal and provincial programs that are available to businesses and organizations. One of the questions Adam asked me is, how should entrepreneurs and organizations access these? Thoroughly. Okay. So you need to either internally or get help from a service provider to very thoroughly assess your eligibility for every one of those programs and access them. When I talked earlier about a sensitivity analysis, I had an example this week where one of my clients didn't think that they had a cash flow issue. We did a little bit of sensitivity on that, and all of a sudden their urgency has changed. So please, speak with, Larry mentioned Ignite can help, other organizations like Grant Thornton or others can help you to assess your eligibility. Please, for the sustainability of your organization, access what you need in order to make sure that you can survive in the medium and longer term.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Krista. I think that we probably could have gone on for an hour with the amount of information, insight, and questions, but we are having a limit. Like I said earlier, we will be following up with those who didn't have their questions answered. But I want to first thank our partners and speakers, including the mayor, Mike O'Brien, His Worship, David Campbell, Herb Emery, Larry Shaw, Krista Hahn, Pat Whalen, Mike Melvin, and Louis Benachete. for joining and sharing their insights with all of us. I want to thank all of you for participating in this call. I hope that you have learned some takeaways that will be valuable in implementing within your companies and organizations. As I mentioned earlier, the video recording will be shared with all of you, as well as online if you know of folks who weren't able to make the live session but would find this information valuable. Please feel free to share that with them. And finally, we will be sending out a satisfaction survey alongside the video, and would welcome your feedback and thoughts in terms of the value of this and whether further sessions like this would be useful for you moving forward. As Krista mentioned, there are a range of business support agencies, including Ignite Fredericton, Planet Hatch, the Fredericton Chamber of Commerce, Opportunities in Brunswick, ACOA, and a number of other private sector partners who do have answers for the questions that you are seeking. If you would like to get in touch with a member of the Ignite Fredericton or Planet Hatch team, we can answer those questions directly or navigate you towards those who will have the specific answers for you. So please don't hesitate to reach out. Once again, thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you to all of you for joining us. We wish you best of luck. Stay safe out there, and we will get through this and look towards a new normal that will reinvigorate the economy in New Brunswick and moving forward. So thanks once again. Everyone have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks very much.